Welcome to another episode of Lessons from the Cockpit. I am your host, Mark Hacera, and for over 24 years, I flew the KC-135 Stratotanker, going all over the world passing gas for a living. But I am also a joint warfighter, and today we're going to talk about that from the Cold War era of the 1960s and 70s. Special thanks to Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar, for sponsoring this episode of our show. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we debrief some of the most captivating and engaging pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. Our guests relate some of their stories from these extraordinary and extreme aviation operations from around the world. But most importantly, we explore their lessons learned to give our listeners practical advice on how does the aviation world work, and expands critical thinking skills and expertise in the air and on the ground. And the stories and lessons learned you're going to hear today have never been told before. On today's show, you're going to hear from a Navy captain, now retired, who flew P-2V Neptune and P-3 Orion maritime patrol and anti-submarine warfare airplanes. And wait till you hear some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures these guys used during the height of the Cold War to hunt Russian submarines and Russian intelligence collection ships. He had some very interesting weapons he was carrying and some very interesting places they were operating out of. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit show with retired Navy Captain Frank Ellis. Frank, welcome to the Lessons from the Cockpit show. Thanks for being on with us today.
Yeah, Mike, thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure, particularly somebody with your background of chasing subs during the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War that many of us experienced, but not like you did in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, we were aggressive young rascals and fearless. I'll tell you, it was when I think back upon some of the stuff I did, it makes me shudder. Tempting fate with the great, thinking about those Russian ships with Turk training their guns on us with some 17-year-old Russian kid with his finger on the trigger, Oh, yeah, they lit us up with fire control radar and everything when you'd run in on them. What I did was I was in patrol squadrons, three patrol squadrons in the years about 66 to about very into 69. The first one was Patrol Trot Squadron 18 out of Rosie Roads, Puerto Rico. And that was more or less a follow-on to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were basically just doing patrol missions all around Cuba and in that area to make sure no Russian ships were getting through to Cuba with missiles on their decks and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So we did a lot of that. And one of the funny stories, though, they had a thing called the Ready One, but you being in SAC, you were familiar with that. You sit around the ready room in your flight suit, waiting for a call.
I remember it well.
Yeah, that's right. We had the same thing. We would have the Ready One. So it was like a Sunday morning or something like that. And I was a co-pilot at the time, and I got assigned to this crew that I didn't normally fly on. Aircraft commander was a Lieutenant Larry Berryman, and he talked with a gravelly voice. Hey, Frank. Hey, how you doing, Frank? One of the guys. And they called us out. Well, Larry had been partying the night before, and he was not happy to be called out at 0:30 to launch. And what it was a Russian spy trawler that had been detected off the coast, and they wanted us to go out and basically photograph it. Mm-hmm. Well, Larry, he was not happy. And me, I was always just happy to fly. It didn't bother me. And the tactical coordinator, who outranked Larry, actually, was in the back. And he directed the tactical situation with the scope and all that stuff. But Larry was a patrol plane commander. That means you're an absolute authority on the airplane. It doesn't matter if you have who's in the back. So we take off. We launch. The co-pilots, we had two jets and two props. When you drew the airplane, you saw what I was talking about in the P2.
Two turning, two burning.
Two turning, two burning. And we called them the J-34 Westinghouse defueling devices because they really ate up the gas. In other words, you didn't leave them on very long. We used them for takeoff and situations. So Larry says, leave the jets up. The tactical coordinator calls up and says, Larry, what are you doing? We're going to burn too much fuel. And Larry says, shut up. So the tactical coordinator locates the vessel, and Larry, he just keeps the jet up. We're hauling for that old World War II kind of airplane. We're hauling toward this thing, and he drops down to as low as he possibly can, and he flies over the deck of this trawler, and it almost lifted the boat out of the water. And I'm going, my God, what is this guy doing? He comes around, and he's going to do another pass. By this time, the Russians on the deck are waving the hammer and sickle at us and shaking their fists and everything. And we just did it again and did it one more time. And Larry says, okay, Frank, we're done. And he goes back to the base. And I thought the tactical coordinator was going to have a conniption fit and get him court-martialed or something. Yeah. But nothing ever came of it. And I just remember that incident. It was the funniest daggone thing. Well, Larry Berryman, I hope he's still alive. He's a little bit older than me.
So explain to our listeners, because some of them may not know what a Russian trawler is, and explain to them what it is and what it's doing, why it's around.
So these rascal Russians, in order to spy, up close on coast and stuff like that, they would have literally a fishing boat. It would look exactly like a fishing boat. Purpose was for spying. It had all kind of spies down in the cabin and antennas disguised and everything. They had those type, and then of course they had regular naval surface things that had electronic spying capabilities too. But this was aggravating because it was on a weekend. Larry was not feeling well. He was just angry. Boy, I tell you, that plane coming over you at about 25 feet above your mast, it must have scared the heck out of those guys.
Well, yeah. And a P-2V is a big airplane. Okay. To all my listeners, Frank is flying in a P-2V Neptune made by Lockheed. It's a big airplane. And those old J-34s, they're noisy. They're really noisy.
I laugh about that to this day.
I remember as a kid, Frank, living in Southern California, and my mom was a surfer, and we'd go to the beach, and you'd see the P-2V Neptunes running up and down the coast. They're just checking things out and everything, but they're coming back, going out to somewhere on patrol, or they're coming back from patrol. But as a kid in the 60s, okay, I'm like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. I remember seeing these things go up and down the beach, and they're not small by any means. They're big airplanes. Okay. So 25 feet above the mast, and you have this big shadow go over the top of you. It probably scared the piss out of everybody.
We hope it did. We weren't real happy with the Russians in those days, as we are not now. And here they are back again. Worse than ever. Go ahead.
And again, so my listeners understand, Frank, tell them your feelings on the Cold War back then, because in the 80s, when I was on alert, and see, this is like 20 years before I was on alert, we had airplanes flying around with nuclear weapons on them. Okay. And you mentioned that to me in a phone call. So talk a little bit about what the Cold War meant to you as a Navy flyer hunting for these subs.
We all watch the news and stuff like that before we went in and everything. But after you get in the service, you start. They give you a little more intel briefings and things like that. It turns out the Russians had nuclear subs off our coast who had the capability of annihilating the entire East Coast. And of course, I got wife, kids, kid, parents, family, all on the East Coast that had been incinerated by the SOBs. So we were motivated. If they ever cut us loose, we were absolutely motivated to kill as many of them as we could. And we would be happy to do that. We were hoping we could do that. And our weapons, we carried all kinds of weapons. The nuclear depth charge was rather spectacular, but we had more, quite frankly, we had more effective weapons, and one of them was a homing torpedo, which I preferred to load on a mission. And the thing was we knew we might be able to get half of them in the beginning of World War III. The other half, we hoped that our attack subs, and we hoped our surface ASW fleet could get the rest. The United States would take a lot of nuclear hits. And we were supposed to stay out there and hunt them until we got low on gas. And if the East Coast was incinerated, we were supposed to go to Brazil, get gas, load up, and go back out and keep hunting until either we killed them all or they killed us. And I'm serious. That's what our motivation was.
Frank, you just said something I didn't know. You guys would go to Brazil?
Yeah, that was in the secret orders package. I can talk about it now because it's 2022.
Mm-hmm.
But we go down there and load up and go back out and fight again. That's what we would do in the event of World War III.
So you had obviously bases that you were assigned to go to.
Well, we had, they were friendly. Brazil was friendly at the time.
Oh yeah, they were big time in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
But this means you had places that you could go that not only had the fuel, but had the weapons that you could load up.
That's right.
In Brazil.
That was what we understood would happen in World War III. Yeah, it was pretty grim. A lot of these youngsters, they don't realize how grim it was. If this guy Putin is threatening us with nuclear weapons, we're getting ready to go back into a grim time.
And it's interesting too that you say that, because people are talking about we're in another Cold War. Some people don't believe it, Frank, but a lot of us that are in the military, have been in the military, we're looking at this going, hey, this is just like being back in the Cold War.
Yeah, we've seen this before. We've seen it before. We would, in addition to the rigging, the shipping surveillance around Cuba and everything. When we deployed, when I went up to Jacksonville and got in BP-7, we would deploy to the Med, and we would track a lot of Foxtrot submarines, and they were a conventional submarine. So they had to come up, they had to snorkel, or they had to surface, and so that would make them a little more vulnerable. However, on one mission, we got a contact. It was obviously the radar operators could tell a sub sailed with the radar image, and they said, "Hey, we got a contact." Went into attack mode. It was Cold War, so we weren't going to sink them, but we came screaming in, and it was a Russian Echo, which is a nuke. We caught a nuke on the surface that we could have killed in a war scenario. I was flying with the skipper of the squadron that day, and he was so happy at our success. He had a giant ceremony at quarters and presented the entire crew with a bottle of scotch. Of course. I mean, we each got a bottle of scotch. He got a case of scotch. A couple of the young fellows on the crew said, "Well, I don't drink." And I said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of that for you."
Yeah. See, I'm a member of the LDS Church, so I don't drink, but I was more than happy to buy liquid refreshment, as we called it, for my air crew and for my squadron. I had my caffeine-free Diet Coke that I used, for all my things. Talk about tradition back then, okay? All of the tradition that we had back then during the 60s and 70s, the camaraderie. I mean, we still have that same camaraderie, but there was a lot of Navy tradition back then too, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was a story about camaraderie, but it may be a little risky to talk about it. If you want me to, I will. It doesn't involve any bad words or sex. It has to do with fighting.
That'll be perfect.
We're in the O Club. I'm married at the time. My wife was a model when I married her. She was a real looker. And so we're at the O Club, all having a good time. The squadron, all the pilots and NFOs and everything, we would go to the O Club on certain nights, and we were all having a good time, and there was music and there was dancing.
Friday nights at the O Club.
A guy, obviously, wife sort of stood out, so he came by and asked her to dance, and she politely said, "Oh, no, thank you." He called her a bad word, which I can't mention on the radio. And here I am. I'm 5'8", weigh 135 pounds. I leapt up on the table and dove at him and was caught by, there's a bunch of people around. They caught me, and then they stopped the fight. Well, here's where the camaraderie came in. A couple of my squadron mates says, "Hey, don't worry about it, Frank. We'll take care of this." So it turns out later that the squadron guys hid in the bushes, and when this guy came walking out, they jumped out and beat the hell out of him and told him, you can't be rude to our women. That was a good camaraderie thing. It was funny. They said, "We'll take care of it, Frank."
But see, that's an important lesson, I think, for everybody, is when you're in a squadron, unless your leadership is toxic, I will make that caveat. If you're in a squadron with great leadership and great people, life is sweet. And you take care of each other. You watch each other's back, don't you?
Those were the good squadron days. Yeah, I noticed that. I enjoyed that. But after that, I went on to flying I went in the reserves and I flew S2s, which is an ASW mission, but we didn't do any deployments overseas or anything. And then finally I went up to VP 68. That was a P3 squadron. So I got qualified in the P3, but we deployed over to the Med and we're constantly chasing and tracking Russian subs. The saying is, if we can track them, we can attack them. So we always kept that in mind. We had this folder in the plane in a certain compartment, which you're familiar with SAC. They had all that stuff. You get a message, a flash message that says, okay, it's on. We'd take the folder out and say, you're cleared to attack any contact, stuff like that. That was about the end of my patrol days, we'll call it not combat, but operational stuff. And then the rest of my career was it was interesting, but I don't know if we have time to go through all of that. There was a lot involved after that. I retired in 92. That's sort of it.
So there's a couple things I want to ask you about. Okay. First of all, when you deployed to the Med, where were you flying out of?
We have deployed out of Rota was one place, and another was Sigonella, Sicily.
I have been to both of those places. They're phenomenal locations. So you're flying out of Rota, and so you're Rota, Spain, and Sigonella on the island of Sicily. So those are really incredible locations during that time period, because, correct me if I'm wrong, you're not only chasing subs, but there's surface action groups and Russian ships that you're also tracking around through the Med during that time period too.
There was a time when we would run in on the Russian ships real close. We'd end up with a fire control radar on us. This got to be so apparently worrisome to the Russians that they arranged with our, I guess, State Department or our government a treaty where we would have a standoff distance. So we couldn't come any closer than 500 feet to a Russian warship. And so that was disappointing, because we'd like to blow the garbage off those decks too.
Disappointing.
Yes.
But see, that's another thing. A really cool piece of information is you guys were getting lit up a lot, weren't you?
Oh yeah. In a real war scenario, it would have been very dangerous for us. Even
during this very tense period, you're flying around these ships, and and it's like a language, isn't it? Because they're talking to you by lighting you up. You're talking to them by flying low over their deck, and they know that you've got people in the windows taking pictures and doing all kinds of stuff. If I remember right, the P3 had a big searchlight on one wing. You guys could even do this at night. Okay. 70 million candle power. If you're standing in front of that and it comes on and you're looking at it, you won't be seeing anything ever again. 70 million candle power? Good.
It was a bright rascal. We lit up a sub one night, happened to be a French sub, so we didn't know what it was. And we lit them up, and they were raising hell on the radio. Turn that light off. And they were running on the surface. Finally, we worked it out on the radio that you guys are a French sub, so you're not a Russian. But
sorry about that.
Sorry about that.
Just so our listeners understand, just walk us through your process for finding, fixing, and tracking a sub. I'm assuming that when you go out to an area, you have a general idea. It's out here somewhere in this area, but you've got to really refine that target solution.
Yeah. So of course, before we launch, we have intel, which is usually some of it comes from these underwater listening device systems that we have. We called them SOSUS at the time, but the acronym is probably gone. So we would get intel that there's a Russian Charlie out there in the general area. So we would go out there and we would start dropping sonobuoys in a rather large pattern and just listen. And then if our operator got a hit on one of the sonobuoys, or basically a sound pattern, then we would sort of try to localize the search and on that particular sonobuoy and drop another pattern. And then finally, when we got like a course and speed on him, then we could drop down and use the magnetic anomaly detection gear. We call it MAD gear. But we have to fly very low over the water with that. We would fly these MAD tracks And if you got a madman, it could be attack criteria. So we frequently did it that way. We dropped a lot of sonobuoys in the Atlantic. I think the bottom is littered with them. At the time, they wanted to let us know how much they cost. It's just like throwing a TV set out your window every time you drop one of those.
Oh, that's what they told you.
It's a funny story about that sonobuoy. We were dropping sonobuoys on a sub off the coast of Portugal. And the damn thing surfaced. I think it was old rickety whiskey or foxtrot sub.
Yeah.
And they surfaced and they grabbed hold of the sonobuoy. They drug it down into the sub, but the cable with the microphone on it is, God knows, I don't know, a couple of hundred feet long or something. It hangs down in the water, And we could hear them hauling that cable in for about 15 minutes. And they're speaking Russian. And then finally they buttoned up and they went sinker and they were gone. We went, scratching their head. Well, what the heck was that?
So you could hear them through the microphone on the sonobuoy?
Oh, yeah. We could hear them talking and everything. They took it down inside the sub and we were laughing. The sonobuoy is a very simple thing. It's not anything where if the Russians take it apart and re-engineer it, they haven't got anything. Just a very simple thing.
But they had the mic inside the sub and you could still hear them talking.
They did. The sonobuoy is like a little tube, and punch it out the bottom of the plane, and it's like a little retarded parachute on it. It drops in the water, and then the salt water and everything causes it to go turn on the electronics in it.
Yeah.
Some buoys the old days were active, and some were passive. Most of the ones we used were passive. We had active sonobuoys for more close-in localized searches.
So when you say active, Frank, you're saying it's sending out a ping. Like in the movie Hunt for Red October, one ping only, Vasily, one ping only. And it's going bing, bing, bing. And then it is echolocating based on that ping, right? Whereas the passive one is just there and it's just doing nothing but listening.
Yeah, the operators are so skillful, they can hear a particular propeller sound from a sub, and they can almost identify the kind of sub it is from just the sound of the propeller. And the other machine, there's machinery on there that's making noise and stuff like that. I don't know what they're doing these days, but it's probably, I'm talking about technology from the 60s. That must be far advanced now.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we can only imagine what's in these Seawolf class subs now, huh?
Yeah.
Who knows what these Seawolf class submarines are picking up and how far away they're picking it up. And not only that, how far away they can probably shoot something. Because, they carry Tomahawk land attack missiles, cruise missiles inside of them now, too. And those can be used on a number of targets. So, hey, I want you to explain for our listeners what you mean by mad gear. I know what it is. Explain to our listeners what the mad gear is and what it's looking for.
The Earth's line of magnetic lines, the natural magnetic field of the Earth, is a certain pattern to it. You take a large metal object, even under the water, and you fly over it. As you approach, it's the magnetic anomaly detection gear is reading like the regular magnetic field of the Earth. But when it goes over this large metal object, it causes an anomaly. So magnetic anomaly detection. And when you're right over the sub, in this case, and the operator calls out, madman, madman, and you punch out a smoke, and it marks where the sub is at that time. I can't remember correctly, I think we had to come around and get like three confirmed passes in order to drop a weapon. I think that's what, we never dropped a weapon on. We only dropped what they call PDCs on them. They were like little hand grenades. You throw them out, and they were a sound device. You created an underwater sound device, and sometimes we would drop those, and that was they could hear those pop, and basically we're telling them, we got you.
Because their sonar operator, and their sonar operator in the submarines are also doing their thing. Okay. And I'm sure they hear the sonobuoys plopping in the water because it has I'm sure a short sound signature. And they're trying to maneuver away from them and doing all kinds of stuff.
It was quite a game.
Well, it's a three-dimensional chess game, isn't it, Frank?
It is.
Because you're above surface, then you've got on the surface, then you've got below the surface. So you really are playing like a three-dimensional chess game with all of this.
Yeah.
Tell me what it was like flying the P-2V. It's a 1950s, 1960s airplane. Obviously, it's land-based and stuff. Talk to us a little bit about the performance of it, how fast it goes. How long could you stay up on a load of gas? Those kinds of things.
I think we stayed up 14 hours, but generally 10-hour missions were the norm. The plane cruised at about 180 knots. And if we lit the jets, we could probably get it up to about 280 knots, something like that. I've forgotten now, but it would go pretty fast for an old, almost a World War II kind of design plane. But it was a kind of plane that the pilot had to fly. Didn't have a lot of this fancy autopilot stuff that the button pusher guys in the airlines use these days. You had to fly it. It was heavy on the controls. It was long, as your artwork shows. Yeah. When you were landing, you had an additional feature on the elevators that we called a varicam, because to pull the nose up, you literally, in addition to inputs on the yoke, you had to be actuating this switch, which would be very analogous to a trim switch, but it was varicam. That was one feature where you had to watch out, be trained how to use it. I was on one training flight in the back, because a lot of times they put a couple of pilots in the back and then the training pilots up front. And he goofed up, didn't have the varicam set right. When we had the power for takeoff, the nose pitched up so high that the instructor was screaming. And I remember that. I remember that guy, Frank Ellis. I wonder if he's still alive. That guy was funny. He was one of the few people, in the Navy, when you walk in the bar with your cap on, you know what we have to do? We have to buy what that means. Bar.
Buy a round for the bar.
Okay.
Hat off in the bar.
There must be hundreds of people in the bar, and we're all sitting around a table, and here goes Frank. Frank's a big old tall guy from New York. He is a New York Italian. Thank Delator. So he comes walking in the door, and he's got his hat on. It's like slow motion. We're going, Frank, you're a hat, and he's lollygagging, walking through the door. The bell rings, and we were all ensigns at the time. He barely had enough money to pay the bar bill, and he was wrecked. That was the funniest thing.
But he learned.
Frank.
He learned not to do that again.
Frank Delator. Yeah.
He learned not to do that again.
Yeah, to this day, even go to the grocery store, I'm wearing my baseball cap, and I go, and I always take it off.
When you go indoors?
You're supposed to. But I don't have to now. I'm retired. I can do what I want. It's ingrained in you.
Yeah, but see, those are some of the traditions people don't understand now. You know what's crazy?
Oh, yeah.
People don't even go to
a lot.
People don't even go to the O Club now, because I think it's all ranks club now. I don't think there's officers. Maybe there is still in the Navy. I don't know. Frank, to tell you the truth. You're there near Oceana. You would know.
I hadn't had any need to go out to the O Clubs to chase girls anymore. Funniest thing out at Oceana, I went back 20 years ago when I was going out there. When you go into base, you got to show the ID card to the guard. The guard at the gates, and the USC salutes you, and you go into the O Club. A carload of girls comes up to the guard post, and he waves them through. No ID, no nothing. All they have to say is, "We're going to the O Club." Those were the days. Those were the days.
Those days are gone.
I know it.
I actually flew into Oceana once during the 80s on a Friday, and went to the O Club with my buddy. Okay. And we hear all this screaming and hollering coming out of the bar. Walked in and got quite an eyeful, They called it Animal Night, I think, or something like that. And they did it in conjunction with the other O Club at Miramar. It was kind of fascinating.
Well, you Air Force guys did us a service. You guys would come over in your flight gear, flight suits, in the club. And we're not allowed to come in the club in our flight suits. And then the Air Force guys started coming in. And they went, they were asked probably initially, like, what are you doing? They go, well, this is a working uniform. So we raised Cain. After a while, we could go in the O Club in our flight suit, coming from the flight line, if you want to go directly to the O Club.
Now, isn't that something? You just brought that up, and I didn't realize that when I walked into that bar, Phil Barmore and I were flying in a T-37. It's called Advanced Co-Pilot Acceleration, where we would get flying time in this little airplane, this little trainer. Yeah. And we flew down there, and we were in our flight suits, but most everybody in the bar was in their whites, right out of Top Gun, right out of Top Gun. And I didn't realize that until you just said something. Isn't that amazing? That's like 30 years ago. And I know people were kind of looking at us like, why are you guys here? But they'd see the Air Force patches and everything on us. Like, oh, okay, you guys are Air Force. Now we understand.
Yeah. You guys helped us out. Now our guys should go in their flight suits.
I had no idea.
Used to be.
I had no idea that happened. No idea. When you left the operational world, you went out to China Lake and were doing testing on weapons and things like that. Is that correct?
The whole purpose of China Lake was weapons testing. I was the airfield operations officer out there. Also, I flew as a project pilot. So there were several airplanes. It was a great time for me as a pilot. I got to fly about 5 different airplanes. I was having a great time. But they were testing some bizarre weaponry out there. You know this thing the accused the Russians of dropping what they call a vacuum bomb?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you know what that is.
I know what that is. Explain that to our listeners, because that's a really interesting bomb.
Well, we used to call them FAEs, FAEs. They're fuel-air explosion. What happens is they drop the bomb. It explodes enough that a giant dome gasoline mist rises, like in a big dome. Mm-hmm. And then these little igniters come shooting out. And when they light off, the whole dome of gasoline, which is now mixed with air, explodes. And I swear, I've seen these things, and they look like an atomic blast. I mean, even a mushroom cloud. So what they're for is they're pretty cruel weapons, but they're for is overpressuring. So if you got a whole bunch of Iranian civilians in an apartment building hiding for their life, they drop one of these things nearby, the overpressure from it will kill them. It was designed initially to go in and kill the enemy that were in caves, generally the caves up in North Korea. That's what it was designed for. So if those Russians are doing that against civilians, that's not nice.
Frank, here's something about that. During the war in Afghanistan, we were having to deal with the caves again, and we did the exact same thing. They filled a laser-guided bomb, the 2,000-pound penetrators we call GBU-24s.
Yeah.
And they would skip the bomb into the back of the cave, and it would release that aerosol through the cave. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then it would ignite it, a delayed fuse on it. I say delay, I'm talking like nanoseconds. And it would literally just clear out the cave. And when I got to our operational test and evaluation center down at Kirtland Air Force Base, the Air Force Operational Test and Evaluation Center, I went and looked up that particular program because I found the name for it. It was called Divine Kingfisher. All of our weapons programs have the word divine in them. I was able to go on our web folders and I found that and went through and read all of the stuff on how they figured out how to drop these laser guided bombs into caves, and they would skip them into the cave so that the bomb would come apart. And then, like you said, that aerosol would go in there.
Yeah.
And the program was called Divine Kingfisher. I thought that was really fascinating that you had mentioned that kind of fuel air explosive in caves in North Korea, because now we had to use that same technology. Isn't that a great lesson learned? Hey, these caves aren't any different than the caves in Afghanistan. Okay. And we can use that same technology over there.
I guess they're a controversial weapon. What are you supposed to do? I mean, what are the rules of war? There is no rules of war. This is ridiculous.
Oh, and that's a great point.
That from the enemy's perspective, we adhere to the rules of war. We do, but the enemy, no, they don't.
No, and we've learned that, haven't we, over and over again?
Yes.
You said that you flew several types of airplanes while you were at China Lake. The P3s are just coming online, I think, when you get there, or they've been in the fleet for a while. What other airplanes are you flying while you're there?
Well, there were no P3s out there. We had one of the projects I worked on was the National Parachute Test Range. And they used, get this, an old, you would call it the C-47. We call it the C-117, and the airlines call them DC-3s. But they are excellent parachuting bird. So the test parachutists, which were trying to develop, at the time, they were developing these steerable chutes for military. And so we climbed altitude, jump master would put out the test parachutists, so they test performance to these chutes. They all had on the chest packs in case the test parachute didn't work out. So that was one of the projects that I worked on. And then a lot of the other planes were mainly logistics planes. There was a C-131, which was a Convair. That's an old twin-engine reset, it's almost like an airliner. and we'd use that for logistics. And then I'm trying to think, I had one little twin engine plane there that was when Eisenhower was president, he used it as one of his aircraft to get around in. Unlike Air Force One, it was a smaller, helicopters weren't all that trusted, so it was an Aero Commander. So that was one.
Oh, really?
And I flew that one. That was, and I'm trying to think whatever else. I don't know. Gosh.
But you really didn't care about the airplane. You just wanted to go fly.
Yeah, you're right. That's what I signed up for, to be a pilot. And we had another plane, which was the next version of the Caribou. We called the Buffalo, and it was, instead of receps on it, the Army had a Caribou. We bought a version out there that had twin turboprops on it.
Uh-huh.
And it was a heck of a performing airplane as far as short takeoff and land. I literally could land that plane and stop, and I'm not kidding you, in the length of a football field.
Wow,
That's
amazing.
We didn't need to have any of that tactical, use the tactical stuff, because we were using it to put out test parachutists and and also logistics, cargo stuff. I just wanted to see what it would do one day. I landed down to the end of the runway and literally had to taxi up to the first, where you enter the runway, the taxiway. Yeah. You get ready to take off. I had to taxi up to that. It was such a short This thing was amazing. And it was the Havilland made it. But that was one of them. I'm trying to think of another. I think we had they used to have a T-28 out there, and the previous operations officer crashed it. And I was mad at him, because that would have been a sweet airplane to fly. It was like a World War II fighter, the T-28.
Oh, and it's got that big, huge reciprocal engine in the front of it too. Yeah,
this knucklehead thought it would be cool to do fly inverted over the Salton Sea, and they didn't quite pull it off. He's lucky he didn't kill himself. I think he came close to killing himself.
Oh, jeez.
That rascal.
Your son Matt told me that every once in a while he got to go fly with you in some of these things. Is that true?
It's amazing, and everything was legal. I could not take him legally. Oh, yeah, I could. On certain logistics flights, when we were overseas, I could take him, and I did. Where he got some of the most interesting flying experiences was later on. One of my tour duties was in Wichita at the Raytheon plant. I was doing acceptance testing on King Airs and things. And the production test pilots liked Matt. They would take him up on test flights. And of course, he would manipulate the controls and everything. He was having the time of his life as a kid.
And how old is Matt now when he's doing this?
He was just like 13 years old or something like that.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Can you imagine as a teenager, 13 years old, and you're out test flying airplanes with your dad's bros?
These guys were testing the airplanes, and they took Matt up with them, having a great time. But these guys, these were good pilots. And I trusted them.
I'm sure they were. Yeah.
They were some great guys out there in Wichita when I was there. You probably heard of McConnell. That was
yeah.
But we were at the Beechcraft facility, which is the Raytheon Corporation.
Yeah.
Testing C-12s for the Navy and the Air Force and the Army, whoever else, Coast Guard. And the Air Force were funny because they came out there one day and they said, "You're testing our planes, you're Navy." I went, "That's right." They said, "Well, we don't like this." And I said, "Well, fine. If you don't want me to test the airplanes, just go back to Mac and tell them that you don't want to do that." And they went, I said, "Because we have, this is a joint operation, and I'm very qualified in airplanes, and I know what I'm doing. So, but go ahead and ask Mac if you want to relieve me from testing the planes." And they went, "Never mind."
Yeah, Military Airlift Command probably went, "Okay." But what does it matter? I mean, really, truly, what does it matter if you're Navy or Air Force? Because the test card is going to tell you what you got to do anyway, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And you're not going to change the test card for whoever, it doesn't. The test card doesn't care if you're Air Force, Navy, or Marine Corps, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I was very well trained to do, obviously, to be a testing airplanes, you have to be very well trained. I was nice to him. I wasn't nasty to him or anything like that, but I said, "Yeah, just check with Mac. Ask him if you'd like to have me replaced."
Yeah. See, and for all the listeners out there, MAC is Military Airlift Command, which was what it was called back then. Now it's Air Mobility Command. It's the same. We're talking to the same group. We're talking to the same people. Okay. It doesn't
MAC
matter.
Was powerful.
Yeah.
MAC was very big and powerful.
You've got a point there.
Yes, it was.
Because, it's not just the Breechcraft King Airs we're flying. We're flying on C-141s. We're flying C-5s.
Yeah, that's right.
We're all kinds of huge airplanes. And McConnell is a big base anyway. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a Boeing plant there too, that they were building things there all the way back to World War II.
There was, I don't know, but they were building B-29s or B-24s. I'm not sure. B-29s. But they were building bombers out. I think it was B-29s. B-17s.
Imagine being there during that time period where you've got all these airplanes flying around. All these different airplanes that you're flying, as well as I don't know what McConnell was back at that time period, but it may have been an old SAC base or something like that. Who knows? Because tankers have been there for a long time.
McConnell is a joint operation. McConnell supported me. In other words, I could go over and get my flight physicals over there. And did this, and I could get all the flight gear I wanted and everything. The Air Force seemed to have a lot of money for flight gear. And I'd go in. It's cold out here in the wintertime. You got any Arctic gear for me? Oh yeah, yes sir, right here. Full Arctic gear and everything.
All the mucklucks and the big overcoat and everything.
Yeah. It'd be like freezing cold in Kansas out there in the snow. Blowing sideways.
Yeah, minus 30 degrees.
Have to pre-flight a plane out there. I was testing T-34s also with the T-34C, which was a turboprop T-34.
Yeah, the Mentor, which you guys use as a primary trainer.
Yeah, they had the original ones was the recep thing, but the turboprop one was a very nice performing little plane.
Before they went to the new T6s.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Amazing stuff. Well, we've been talking almost an hour now. I'm trying to think of a few more things to ask you about the Cold War period. And you mentioned some things too.
Well, I've got another anecdote I'll tell you.
Sure. Go right ahead.
Okay. Remember we told you about the spy trawlers?
Yes.
Okay. Well, they were also in the Med. So when we were deployed to, the intel officer brought us the crews in and we've been looking for this trawler, the Zorkov or whatever, and we can't find it. We don't know where it is, and we've run a couple of patrol missions, and we'd like to locate it and all that. And so when you go out, keep a lookout for it. And we're going sure. Well, every day, me and Rick Rigler would drive to our homes off base, and our wives were over there. And we wore aviation green, a uniform that looked impressive to the Italians, apparently, because Rick said, let's do the shortcut through the harbor. Usually the harbor was like restricted. You couldn't go in there. So we'd pull up to the guard post and just wave at him and go right on through. We'd be in our aviation greens. We went by this one ship, and I looked at it and we said, that's Russian. And he says, you know what that is? That's a trawler they've been looking for. It's right here in the port. So we took a bunch of pictures. We took a bunch of pictures and went back to the intel officer and said, hey, we got pictures of the trawler. He goes, how'd you get these? It looks like he's in port. I said, yeah, it's right over here in the port in Catania right now. He goes, I'll be...
That's hilarious. You're looking for a boat out at sea and it's tied up in your own port.
Yeah, it's right.
Your own harbor.
Yeah, we were laughing at that.
Yeah.
Rick Rigler, that guy was a character. He went to work for the FBI. I don't know. Hopefully he's still around too. He was a good guy.
Yeah, that comes back to that whole lesson learned about work smarter, not harder. You got the boat tied up there right in port. So did the Russian guys say anything to you while you're walking around the dock?
We were just driving by, and I said, Rick, you got a camera in the car? And he went, yeah, take here. And so we stopped and we took pictures of them, and we didn't get any objection because they're basically, it was weird, they're in a NATO country's port. We went, how can this be? But anyway, they were.
Oh, I didn't even think of that.
Yeah.
They're in an Italian port. A Russian spy trawler is parking in an Italian port.
Yeah, that's right. It's
food, gas, who knows what.
Yeah, they probably didn't tell the Italians that they were a spy trawler. They probably said they were actually a fishing trawler. We recognized the intel, the pictures and stuff that we get. We could identify it.
Oh, man. Isn't that funny? You're looking all over for this thing, and there it is right there. And I'm sure the intel, like you said, the intel guys are like, where did you get these? Where did you get these? Hey, you guys need to spend more time in port, okay?
Yeah, that was funny.
You spent a lot of time, Frank, it sounds like, learning about the different threats. You spent a lot of book time, didn't you, learning about the different subs? More importantly, you probably spent a lot of time learning about what they sounded like, didn't you?
Yes, we were always more or less having classroom time on, for identifying. But really, the pilot's job was if it was on the surface, we wanted on the eyeball, we wanted to be able to identify it like right away, what kind of sub it was and everything. Because usually when they're detected, they go sinker. If you see one, basically it's the shape of the sail that gives it away. As far as the sound signatures and things like that, we really didn't get involved in detail in that. We had experts, we'd go back and he'd call up the cockpit and say, hey, we're tracking a so-and-so here. If we had the luxury, we'd go back and take a look at the strip that's coming out. And you can see a little bit of a different pattern and stuff. But that's about as close as I got to that particular sensor. So we had sensor operators in the back there.
Talk about the crew that you had on the airplane, because obviously you have to aviate, navigate, and communicate. The 3 words every pilot knows. Explain to our listeners on the P2V and even in the P3s, the air crew that you have on board and what their specialties are, besides just the pilots.
You have the patrol plane commander, and you have a co-pilot, and there's a third pilot, and that's basically for relief. So if you go out on a long patrol, you can swap pilots out. The pilot being relieved can go back and relax, get a cup of coffee, or even stretch out or something. So those are the pilot positions. Then we had a radar operator, and you have a radio operator, and we had a navigator who was a naval flight officer. We had a tactical coordinator who was also a naval flight officer. Sometimes the tactical coordinator could be the mission commander, but the pilot, the patrol plane pilot, was absolute authority over the safety. So if the mission commander said, I need you to go 600 miles north because they've got a contact up there, well, the pilot would say, can't do it. We don't have enough gas. That would be a simple example. And then we have a sensor operator who was the one that was listening to the sonic, the sonobuoys. In the rear, you had ordnance, and that would be the guy throwing out the sonobuoys. Or in the case where, if in a wartime scenario, he'd be basically helping to manage the weapons as best as you can. It wouldn't necessarily have to go down to the bomb bay, and I believe we had I think there were another crewman back aft there that was like more or less the assisting the ordnance guy. Usually ran with about 11-man crew. Did that add up to 11?
For some of these, like the tactical coordinator and the sensor operators, did you have more than one position that they could sit at? Or was it just one guy on a scope, or were there 2 scopes?
The radar operator had a scope. The tactical coordinator had a repeater scope that showed the same thing. Those were the 2 scopes, and I can't remember, but I thought we had some sort of display in the cockpit, the P3, that could also display something. We obviously had.
I remember seeing pictures of like a big white round display that was like right above the console that was between your knees. I'm assuming that was that display that would show where the sonobuoy patterns are, or where the contacts are, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's kind of like your repeater scope up front, wasn't it?
Yeah. And ours in the P2 is a little more rudimentary. We did have a radar screen up in the cockpit, but I don't remember if we actually could see what the tactical coordinator was plotting on his scope in the back. I'm not sure.
So an 11-man crew in the P2V, and probably about the same in the P3s too. And they've all got the same functions, correct?
Yeah.
The same functionality.
A lot of times a pilot could go back and relieve the navigator, the off-duty pilot. But being pilots, we hated to do the navigator job. We resist that because when I came in, when you went to the squadron as a third pilot, you were the crew navigator. We didn't have an
okay.
navigator. Now, I actually had to go to navigator school. So I have 400 hours as a tactical navigator, and all you can think of as a pilot is like, I got to get one of the co-pilots. Somebody needs to leave the squadron so I can move up to at least co-pilot position. That's all we were striving for. Then when you're in the co-pilot position, now you're in a good spot.
I didn't realize that you went, that the sub warfare guys were pilots and trained navigators. That's fascinating.
Oh, yeah. In the early days. That's right.
Here's a question for you.
I navigated across the daggone Atlantic Ocean.
Oh, did you really?
Oh, yeah.
Your 400 hours of navigating around in your logbook, you had some pretty long flights then going across the Pacific or going across the Atlantic and just out and about running around hunting for subs.
Another little anecdote on navigating is there was a crew that had to go up to Jacksonville, and I wanted to go up to Jacksonville with them because I had some time off. So I took the third pilot position on plane. And so I just wanted to ride, but I was happy to navigate. So and it's at night, and we're in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle. We're heading toward the United States.
Oh, no.
And we had Loran A in those days, and that failed. It's too cloudy down below beneath us to use a drift meter. I couldn't get a star shot. I had nothing but DR. So we're going along, and told that radar operator, I said, pilot said, so what's our heading, Nav? I said, west. We're not going to miss the United States if we just head west. So sure enough, radar operator starts painting the coast. I looked at it and I went, holy mackerel, that's Florida. We're supposed to be going to Norfolk. So I told the pilot, I said, turn 20 degrees north. And finally, we navigated on radar in order to get into Norfolk.
I remember doing that in the KC-135. I remember doing that kind of, radar mapping in the KC-135. And it wasn't real good, mind you, but you could certainly pick out islands and the coast. And as you got closer, you could pick out all kinds of ground targets. Yeah. You mentioned something, Loran A and drift and no star shots and stuff like that. Think about it, Frank, because pilots nowadays, particularly young pilots, have no idea what that is. No. Celestial navigation. That's like what Magellan did. That's how you guys got around. Yes. That's how we got around.
We actually did it.
We actually got around by using the same kind of methods that Magellan used, And
but I've read some stories about the Polynesians, the way they navigated in the Pacific, and they said they could tell by like cloud patterns sometimes where an island might be. So we used to fly patrols all at very low altitude around north of Cuba. I was navigating and I lost the information I needed. So I went up to the cockpit and I'm looking around at the horizon. And I was looking, we were supposed to be coming upon an island that I could use as a fix. So I'm looking, and I looked at these cumulus buildups way up, it must have been 100 miles away. And I said, steer for those. And sure enough, we got in there was the island. And that's the way the Polynesians, would do it. So I use Polynesian navigation.
That's amazing, Frank. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But you're correct, because anybody that's been to Hawaii has seen, like, in the afternoon where the clouds like roll over the top of the mountains, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And every afternoon at 4:00, it seems like islands, particularly in the Pacific, where I was in Okinawa and Guam and things like that, you get those 4:00 rainstorms in the afternoon. And it was always building up between 4 and 4:30, and then it would pour for about a half hour and then it'd go away.
Yeah.
Man, I didn't think of that. That is amazing stuff.
Yeah. See, my philosophy was use any information you possibly can use. If I can see birds will let you know too, but we're doing too fast and we didn't want to get too close to birds anyway.
Oh, ain't that the truth, man? How many bird strikes have you and I had in our careers? Holy smokes.
Several.
I had a fully mature red-tailed hawk go down the right intake of my T-38 on a touch and go, and it trashed the engine, Frank.
Oh, yeah.
Trashed the engine. And the smell inside the cockpit was terrible. Terrible, because the pressurization system ran off the right engine. Ran off the right engine. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
I mean, think about the tools that pilots have now where you've got GPS that I took off from Rota, Spain, Frank, and flew to Fairchild Air Force Base. And when we landed, we had to do a nav check, on the boxes to see how tight they were. Mm-hmm. We were only off by 307 feet. After flying all across, we took off out of Rota, went north across Reykjavik, across Greenland, down across Hudson Bay, through Alberta, and then into Fairchild. Okay. That was our route of flight. And we were off only 307 feet when we landed. Because
we're using the inertial nav system.
We were using the ring laser gyro INS tied to GPS.
Yes. Okay.
It's called Iggy. And it took the place of the Navigator in the KC-135.
Yeah. In the last days of flying the P3s, we had a big box that could fit in there, and there was an inertial nav system, and it would be the forerunner of what you were just talking about. It wasn't that sophisticated, but it was very accurate. Like you say, we'd go long distances and then check it on the deck. We would be within those tolerances, like you were mentioning. That was good stuff. That's good stuff for a warfighting type of aircraft, because you're not dependent upon the satellites or any electronic nav aids. The inertial, you use the inertial. It's all self-contained.
And now, you have the big displays in the cockpits that have the virtual reality that show you all the terrain outside, and you have terrain avoidance. And I worry sometimes that we have lost piloting skill because we rely too much on the boxes.
I am sensing that also, and they're going to be sorry in the future. There are several aircraft crashes here recently where it seems to me that if they had known how to just fly the airplanes, stick and rudder, they would have been okay. To have an autopilot in the plane, if it doesn't have a red button where I can turn it off, I don't want to be in the plane. It's like these new self-driving cars, and they want you to sit there with no steering wheel, no nothing. Well, I'm not getting in those. If I get one of those self-driving cars in the future, it better have a red button on the steering wheel so I can turn it off.
That's right. Yeah. Autopilot off.
off. Turn that thing off.
Exactly. Autopilot off. Yes. People don't understand, Frank, how intense this was, where we're seriously going eye to eye sometimes, eyeball to eyeball, or as we used to say, retina to retina, with the Russians or their satellites. The stuff they're doing in Ukraine is like the Nazis did in World War II. These are bad people, very bad. Those Ukrainians need our help. I was looking at those column of trucks that the Russians they're coming down to, I don't know how many miles long. Yeah.
It's a new column. I just wish we had a squadron of A-10s and would hose down that entire column. That would be fantastic. Probably if you hose down the front end of it, maybe about 20 up trucks. The Russians probably turn tail and run.
You know how many of my A-10 Bubbas have seen that picture and they're like salivating and licking their lips?
I know. Target rich
environment. You got to say, if whoever owns air superiority or air supremacy over a battlefield can basically do what they want. You can certainly see that in this battle too. But the other thing too, Frank, I have not seen this many helicopters being employed in a battlefield like I've seen during this fight in the Ukraine. Okay.
Yeah.
And I know that in the Navy, you had the S-3 Sea Kings on the carrier decks and, of course, on the destroyers and cruisers that were also doing anti-submarine warfare stuff with you too, weren't you?
Yeah, the Hoovers. We call them Hoovers because their engine sounds like they go, ooh, they sound like a Hoover vacuum cleaner.
Oh, yeah.
Call them Hoovers. Yeah, I don't know what ASW planes are using on the carrier now.
Well, the S-3s are all gone. And I think they've pretty much left it up to the helos that are on the cruisers.
Maybe that's what they're doing. Yeah. Well, the helos were very effective. We've exercised with them, and they were very effective. The subs hate them. The helos.
Oh yeah.
They skip around. They can find them.
Well, and you mentioned the SOSUS line, and I remember somebody telling me that, in fact, some of the SOSUS sensors were so sensitive that they would actually pick up the Tu-95 Bear bombers running around. They were really, really good listening devices. Tell me, how accurate is the movie The Hunt for Red October?
Oh yeah, let me see. That's the one that had Sean Connery in there as
Yes. Yes.
as the Russian
Yes.
skipper.
Yep.
I would say it was Tom Clancy. If Tom Clancy had anything to do with the writing the screenplay or anything, I would say it was pretty close on. But there was a little like any Hollywood thing. There's a little bit of inaccuracy. So I would say that's probably an interesting sub to sub interaction movie to watch.
Yeah. See, I was living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire at the time. They're near the sub base. And I had a guy and his wife that lived above me who was a lieutenant commander on the subs there. And he told me, he says, man, there's a lot of stuff in there that I didn't think we could talk about, because it showed the process that they had for hunting subs, like you described, dropping all the sonobuoys and listening. And, it sounds like, Frank, that when you were doing this, there was a lot of boredom, long periods of, what they always say about flying, long periods of boredom interrupted by short intermittent periods of extreme terror, and it sounds like that's what sub hunting kind of was, as the guys for you guys up front, you're flying the plane. The guys in the back may be pretty busy, but up front, you're just I'm just flying the plane, and all of a sudden things get really intense when you get one of these microphone hits, don't you?
Set battle condition 1.
Set battle condition 1.
Yeah. Well, here's a little scary anecdote talking about boredom. Okay, so in a night mission, in a P2, in the Med, and it was an all night mission. So we're going along, and I'm in the co-pilot position. I noticed the pilot was asleep over beside me, looking out. It was dark and everything. I thought I saw like the outlines of like mountains, in the far distance. And we're on a heading that was heading that direction. We used to use I said, nav pilot, nothing. TACO pilot, nothing. Radar pilot, nothing. Ordnance pilot, everybody's asleep on the plane but me. Everyone on the plane was asleep but me. And so I forgot I had to jostle somebody, literally jostle them, and get the radar operator to tell me, what was up ahead. And finally, I woke him up, and sure enough, it was an island. Now, then we were at an altitude where we would not have cleared the tops of the hills. That was one of the scary ones there. I was the only one awake on a whole plane of 11 men.
And I have flown, and I'm not going to go into all the particulars of this, but I have flown with a whole crew that was hungover.
Oh God! That's
a very wild night the night before. Again, like I mentioned to you, I'm a member of the LDS Church, so I don't drink. And I was a co-pilot, and they just said, "Mark, just get us out to the refueling area, refuel the C-141, give him whatever he wants, and then get us home." And my navigator was virtually asleep on his desk. Behind him, his head down on his desk. And the pilot I was flying with, the aircraft commander I was flying with, he's all hungover and is not doing very well. But they knew, since I was a member of the LDS Church, that I wasn't hungover and I could fly the plane. And I literally flew the whole entire mission. And boom operator was in the back, and he said something like, "Man, I'm burping like crazy. I've got these alcohol burps and everything like that." Fortunately, we didn't have a boom interphone, and the C-141 pilot crew are like going, "What are you guys talking about?" The mission was fairly close to the base that I was assigned to, so we weren't going very far. It was really a pretty easy mission to get to and from. But I'll never forget, man, turning around, talking to the nav, and he didn't answer me. And he's got his head down on the desk, and he is out cold. And my aircraft commander looking over at me saying, "Don't you dare tell a soul about this."
That's right. Yeah. Well, we had to keep quiet about a lot of stuff in those days. I mean, some of it was court-martial stuff. We looked after one another.
Oh yeah. And you know what? They knew I'd get us home. They knew I'd get us back down and everything like that. But man, it was really spooky, man, flying with this crew, like, you know, because their heads are all nodding back and they're a little fuzzy in the head. And you know what? I took advantage of their condition. As we were coming down out of altitude, I turned the autopilot off and I shook the airplane really good. I went like stop to stop on the ailerons, okay, or something like that, okay? And everybody woke up and goes, "What are you doing?" And I started laughing and laughing and laughing. And they realized what I was doing to them, okay? They knew I was poking the bear. And they're all screaming and hollering at me, and there's all kinds of expletives going back and forth and everything like that, you know. And I'm just over there laughing and carrying on. And the nav says, "Okay, Co, we're doing one to a full stop, one approach to a full stop." And I thought to myself, you know, I could really screw up this approach because he doesn't know where he's at. I came down and I think I said over interphone, "Okay, crew, going around." And everybody's like, "No, don't go around, land the plane." You know,
That's a good one.
I haven't told people about that.
Little did they know what the guys that out there work for a living really did. Little did they know at the top levels.
But you know what, Frank? Back in the 80s and stuff like that, when I came into the Air Force, it was like a golden period of flying, Frank, because we could actually rent the KC-135. We call it an off-station trainer. Mm-hmm. And we had to put paperwork in like a month before to say, we're going to go to Salt Lake City in February. We're going to refuel FB-111s from our base as they do low-level missions through Colorado. We need 3 crew chiefs to come with us. And we did that every February to Salt Lake City. You know why? So we could go skiing.
Of course.
We would take the airplane out. One crew would fly one day and one crew would ski one day. And then the next day we'd switch. And that was perfectly legal back then. We had a crew that arranged with the Navy. They put the basket, the drogue on the back of the airplane, had 3 crew chiefs with them, and went to Roosevelt Roads for a week to refuel a Navy carrier air wing that was getting ready to deploy off to the Med. And they go like, the Navy was like going, "How do we get this? How do we arrange this? How do we schedule this?" And it was just because this one crew said, "Oh, hey, down at Roosevelt Roads, these Navy airplanes are going to be down there for a week. Let's go down there on an off-station trainer." They put all the paperwork in, the wing DO approved, one of the colonels on base approved, and they went down Roosevelt Roads for a week. I mean, we could fly the airplane as long as we had receivers. We could go wherever we wanted to go. And on top of that, being a co-pilot, we had the ACE program, the Accelerated Co-Pilot Enrichment Program, where we'd come off of alert. We'd have 4 days off and we'd go fly the T-37, you know, do 3 hops in a day. We'd take off from Pease. We'd go to Plattsburgh. We'd go over to Brunswick, the Navy Air Station at Brunswick, and then come home. And we were getting flying time and we were being told, "You're not flying enough. You're not flying enough. You're not flying ACE enough." And this was shortly after I met my wife. Okay. So I'm dating my wife at the same time. You know, you talk about all these Top Gun movie things, and you mentioned that your wife was a model. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like right out of Top Gun. I had a brand new Ford Thunderbird Turbo Coupe. My fiance, soon to be my wife, would drop me off at the ACE detachment. I'd go fly the airplane for a while. And I'd tell her, "Okay, come back and get me in about 4.5 hours." You know, 4.5 hours, I'd land, post-flight, do all that kind of stuff. And she'd be waiting for me to hop in the car and go home. I mean, it was a really incredible life.
Sounds great.
I know. And see, you guys were doing the same thing, you know, flying around and doing stuff, training. And man, you could get away with a lot by just saying, "I'm going off to do a training mission. My crew's going to go do a training mission." Okay.
Yeah.
Off you go.
Yeah.
Hey, Frank, this has been great stuff. And man, I learned a lot today.
That was one of the greatest times of my life, was flying in the Navy.
Oh, and it sounds like it. But you know what, Frank, you have brought up some stuff today that I have never heard of, like you guys retrograding to Brazil and stuff like this. This is great information that listeners love to hear. And I always tell people, you're going to hear things for the very first time on this show. And you've said like 3 different things today, Brazil being the one of them, that I've never heard anywhere else.
It's probably classified, and probably the guys in the dark suits are going to come after me. Don't tell them where I live, okay?
I won't. All right. You and I are all under assumed names now. So anyway. So I want to thank you for being on and spending time with us today, okay?
Okay.
This was a fun episode, folks. Special thanks to Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar, for sponsoring this episode of the show. By the way, in the show notes, you can buy a profile of the P2V Neptune that Frank flew in the 60s, 4 foot, 6 foot, 8 foot long, by clicking on the P2V icon in the show notes. I want to make you all aware of something that's happening. As many of you probably know, Colonel Gale Halverson, the famous Berlin airlift candy bomber, passed away in February. On the 20th and 21st of this month, Friday and a Saturday, they're going to have a special memorial service for him here in Utah, in the Utah Valley. They're going to reenact the candy bomb from a C-54 that's flying in from the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation. Kids will be able to tie up candy bars, parachutes. They're going to take them up in the plane and drop them on Spanish Fork Airport. The Air Force is bringing in a C-17, and they're going to do a renaming ceremony Friday night and rename the airplane the Spirit of the Candy Bomber. And I've seen the artwork for it, folks. It's really cool looking. It's a C-17 from Charleston Air Force Base that's coming out. Airplanes will be open for tours. I found out today there may be even some more warbirds coming, like P-51s out of Washington State. If you're within striking distance of Provo, Utah, come the 20th and 21st of May to celebrate Colonel Gale Halverson. Previous episodes of my show can be found on my website, markhasera.com. So please have your friends and loved ones go visit my website and listen to all of the podcasts that are there. This makes episode 24, so we're moving right along here. Folks, thanks for listening and coming in and visiting with us today. I hope you really learned something about the 60s Cold War, and we'll talk to you again next week.